All right, we're going to go ahead and get started here. Tonight, we're going to talk a little bit about the project on evolution and biodiversity. Hopefully, what this project is trying to get across to you from an objective standpoint is for you to be able to differentiate between species diversity and genetic diversity. Can you explain what underlying mechanisms exist for the case of biological evolution? Hopefully, after this, you'll be able to compare and contrast some biological selection from artificial selection and really lastly, identify the mechanisms that can lead to speciation. Let's take a few minutes before we actually get into the project and talk a little bit about an introduction to the lesson and how it relates to the project. So, when you think about biodiversity and diversity as a whole, it's very much favored for in nature. Okay, so as diversity among human populations adds to its ability to be more creative for us to solve problems, when you look at diversity within species, when we're talking about DNA and RNA, the genetic makeup of that species is really what's important in all of this. When there's a high degree of diversity, species as a whole can better absorb the shock or the changes that occur when climates change, when pollution increases or changes habitats, when geological forces like volcanic eruptions, earthquakes, forest fires, or human influence come into play. So, um, really, what this whole project wants you to take a look at is the factors that really um, play a role in diversity and diversity of a species. So what my recommendation is before you really get into this project, please make sure that you've taken a look at the lesson on biodiversity. And really what's a big piece in all of this is go to this University of Utah's Learn Genetics website. So when you click that link, it's going to take you here. There's two things that you should really tour. You should check out the tour of basic genetics, and you should take a glimpse at the molecules of inheritance. That used to be called DNA to protein. So when you're actually looking in the Odyssey site, it says tour the basics and the DNA to protein sections. This molecules of inheritance is the new DNA to protein section, and there's a whole bunch of information in here that you can link to and check out. So I really want you to make sure that you've gone through that. Okay, for both of these, and there's the tour of the basic genetics. So especially if you haven't had me for biology, we take a lot of time in bio to go through this. So I want to make sure that if you haven't had me, that you have a good foundation before you really get into this um, information. So with that, um, really what the focus of this project is on genetic diversity. Okay, so when you're thinking about genetic diversity, keep in mind things like the genetic makeup of the organism, which is why I wanted to refer you back to that site. Make sure that you can understand the role of DNA, the role of RNA and proteins as it relates to genetic diversity that's seen in species, number one. And then number two, I really want you to make sure that you understand the process of evolution and natural selection. So again, when you're talking about evolution, those changes in living things that occur over successive generations, okay, and remember that this happens as the genetic variation of a population as it increases and as it changes, those changes occur in successive generations, and it's a result of mutation. It's a result in random changes. It's a result in inherited traits from the offspring, from the parents to the offspring over successive generations, and that's how, of course, how it relates to the genetics component of this. And then finally, making sure that you understand that when we're talking about natural selection, we're talking about mutations and their role as a whole being beneficial. Okay, so when we talk about mutation in biology, a lot of times it has a negative connotation. But from an environmental standpoint, that's not always a bad thing. It's not a bad concept to have genetic mutation in the population because some of those members actually end up with better chances of surviving and producing offspring that may be better suited to deal with those subtle changes over time. So keep that stuff in mind. Please make sure that again, you do review the lesson. And in addition to that, and I'll post this on the site, after that Learn Genetics site, there's a really nice website, the American Museum of Natural History, talks a little bit about Darwinism, Darwin's work, and evolution today as we see natural selection, and how it works, and how long does evolution take, and speciation. So please also take a look at this site, because a lot of the information on this site will help you craft your questions for the project. So now let's actually get into the project and take a look at what it really is asking you to do. Okay, so what this project essentially is for you to generate some type of paper, some type of report that really addresses the three main conceptual questions of this unit. Okay, talking about the diversity of species, okay, through genetic diversity, explaining evolution as it occurs because of natural selection, and then talking about the role of mutations in evolution. Okay, so those are the three fundamental questions, and they can each be addressed in about a paragraph. It can certainly be more, but I definitely don't want it to be less. Okay, so the paper should be well organized. It should have some flow to it, and there should be examples of each of those questions within your paper. Okay. When you're doing this, you can submit it in a Word document, or you can submit it down in the essay box below. Okay. So from there, here's what I would or how I would suggest framing. Okay, so the first question talks about explaining and giving examples of both species and genetic diversity. Okay, so think about this from the perspective of the genetic makeup. Okay, the DNA of the organism of the same species, okay, is the genetic diversity. So those variations that exist, whether it be color, whether it be size, whether it be shape, are what we see when we look at different organisms and different species. Okay, so think about, for example, how dolphin species show variation in their fins, how fish species might show variation, how trees, for example, all show variation, and those can help frame that explanation and that example for that first question. The second question, explain how biological evolution occurs because of natural selection. So, first to do this, I need you to be able to explain to me what is natural selection, how does it occur, okay? And then from there, you can frame it around the larger topic of biological evolution, that, remember, being the large-scale changes in things over successive generations. So explain how evolution occurs because of natural selection. Okay, so that should be a pretty substantial paragraph, because both of those two concepts are really big unifying principles, not just in biology but in the field of environmental ecology as well. So explaining how those two interact with each other and how the larger scale evolution occurs as a result of that is really what I'm looking for there. And then finally, the role of mutations in biological evolution. Okay, remember I said when we first started that mutation isn't always a bad thing. Okay, and that mutations occur when genetic information is passed down through successive generations, because it's a result of a proofreading error in your DNA. Okay, but also frame the answer to this question around the mutation leading to new traits in populations that might not always be a bad thing. So think of some examples, or go back and look at some examples of historical things that have occurred in organisms that are results of mutations that have been both beneficial as well as have been harmful to those populations, and that will help you craft your answer to this question. Okay? So, summing it all up here, you're going to want to answer those three questions. Make sure there's some flow. Make sure that the ideas are logical. And then, of course, make sure that you're writing in complete sentences. Please make sure you're using spell check and grammar check as you're writing these, because as we move along through the year, I'm going to be looking for your development, both grammatically as well as being able to express ideas. Okay? If you have any questions, or other problems that you are having difficulty with the project, certainly come into the VO, and I can certainly help you on a more one-to-one basis. And I hope this video gives you a good idea of what we're looking for. And we'll be back here next week breaking down another project. Have a good week, everyone.